Nathan Griffin walked into the restaurant with the smell of engine grease still faint on his hands, looking for table 7. He found it. He stopped mid-step, one hand still resting on the back of an empty chair, because the woman already sitting there was not a stranger. Julia Hartman sat with her hands folded on the white tablecloth, the same woman he had reported to every single Monday for 14 months. Her eyes lifted. They found his. And they held there. For one long second, neither of them reached for a menu, a chair, or a word. The waiter hovered nearby with 2 glasses of water, unnoticed. Somewhere behind them a door chime rang, and nobody turned to look. Before you find out how 2 people who already knew each other froze across a blind date neither one had asked for. Ask yourself this. If the person your boss had been quietly watching for over a year turned out to be the same person your best friend swore was your soulmate, would you sit down? Or would you run? Nathan sat down. That single decision would cost a man his career, nearly cost another man his freedom from consequence, and would end with a crane groaning under a weight it was never supposed to carry again. But that part comes later. First, you need to understand how 2 careful people, each one building a wall for reasons the other didn't know yet, ended up at the same table without either of them choosing it on purpose. 3 days before that dinner, Megan Hartman cornered Nathan by the bleachers at his daughter's soccer practice, arms crossed, refusing to let him say no for a 3rd time. "You work too much," she said, "and you smile too little." He opened his mouth. She talked over him before he could get a word out, the way she always did when she'd already decided something for both of them. "I know someone," Megan said. "She's kind. She's busy like you. That's all you're getting." Nathan had known Megan for almost a year, ever since their daughters ended up on the same team, sharing the same cold folding chairs on Saturday mornings that started too early and ended in orange peels and shin guards. He knew her laugh, loud, sudden, a little too big for the bleachers. He knew she brought extra orange slices for the whole bench, not just her own kid. He knew the way she talked with her hands when she was building an argument you weren't allowed to win. He did not know her last name. She had never volunteered it. He had never asked. In Erie, that was how you kept a friendship simple. Work stayed work. Everything else stayed exactly as complicated as you let it get, and Nathan had made a private decision, years ago, never to let anything get complicated again. That was the rule he had built his whole life around since Rachel died. His days had settled into a shape he could count on, the way a man counts screws before he starts a job, so nothing goes missing halfway through. Up before dawn. Sadie's lunch packed the night before because mornings moved too fast for improvising. The yard by 6. Home by 5 unless a shipment ran late. Dinner most nights at the same scratched kitchen table Rachel had picked out at a flea market the year they got married, haggling the vendor down $4 over a wobble in the left leg she said gave it character. He had built that routine on purpose, brick by brick, because a life with no surprises in it was a life that couldn't be taken away from him twice. He almost said no to Megan again, the way he had the first 2 times. Then Sadie, 9 years old and stubborn in a way that hurt to look at because it was so exactly her mother, looked up from tying her cleats and said, without any idea what she was about to do to her father's carefully sealed life, "You should go, Dad. You always tell me I should try new things." He couldn't argue with his own line thrown back at him. That settled it. And that is the first thing worth remembering about this story. It did not begin with Nathan wanting anything. It began with him running out of reasons to say no. To understand why saying yes to a stranger cost him more than most men spend deciding whether to change jobs, you have to understand what a Tuesday used to mean in his house. Rachel had died on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind of Tuesday that announces itself with weather or warning. An ordinary Tuesday, the kind that shows up in a person's calendar looking exactly like the one before it and the one after it, except this one had a warehouse frame in it that had been signed off on by a man in a hurry. Nathan had not been there when it happened. That was its own particular cruelty, the kind grief specializes in. The not being there, the finding out secondhand, the reconstructing of a moment you will spend the rest of your life imagining in detail you have no right to have invented. He had been 3 counties over on a different site that morning, phone buzzing in his pocket with a message he wouldn't read until lunch, by which point everything that could be changed had already stopped being changeable. The frame Rachel had flagged twice, in writing, with her signature and her stamp, and a formal memo that used the word urgent because she was not a woman who used that word lightly, had been approved anyway, because approving it meant a deadline got met, and meeting the deadline meant a bonus got paid, and the man who signed off on it never once had to stand where Nathan stood 3 hours later, staring at a section of collapsed steel with his wife's badge number still visible on the site. Log. He did not go back to work as an engineer after that. He tried for 6 weeks to convince himself he could. He sat in meetings and watched load calculations scroll across the screen and felt his hands go cold every single time. The way some men flinch at a sound long after the war that taught them to flinch is over. So he quit. He packed the office. He did not frame his commendations. He put them in a box in the garage where Sadie, years later, would find them while looking for Christmas decorations and ask him what they meant, and he would tell her, carefully, in the smallest true version of the story a 9-year-old could hold without it breaking her. He built the new life the way he'd once built load-bearing frames, with excessive, deliberate margin for error. A schedule that left no hour unaccounted for. A house with exactly the right number of surprises in it, which was none. A daughter who never once had to wonder whether her father would be there when she woke up because he had made absolutely certain of it, every single morning, for 6 straight years. He told himself this was healing. Most of the time, he believed it. It is only in hindsight, looking back from the other side of a woman named Julia Hartman, that Nathan would come to understand the difference between a life that is healed and a life that has simply been sealed shut so nothing else could get in to hurt it, and how very different those two things actually are, no matter how similar they look from the outside, on any given ordinary Tuesday. Across town, Julia Hartman took the same phone call from her sister with far less resistance than Nathan had shown, and far more caution than she let slip into her voice. "His name's Nathan," Megan said. "That's all you get until Friday. No last name. No photo. No snooping." Julia said yes before she let herself think too hard about why the name landed the way it did, settling somewhere behind her ribs instead of passing through politely, the way most names did. Nathan was common enough. Half the men in Erie were named Nathan. She did not ask for a last name either. She told herself it was because she liked surprises. The truth sat closer to the opposite of that. She didn't want to know, in case knowing made her hope for something she had spent 14 months training herself not to hope for. 14 months earlier, Julia had taken the regional director post at Great Lakes Freight and Logistics, and from her first week, she had made the Erie terminal her own, the busiest, the most complicated yard in the entire region, the one that needed someone watching it closely and often. That was the official reason she gave the board when they questioned why a director spent so many hours on the floor instead of behind a desk 3 towns over. It was true. It was also not the whole truth, and she knew it every single time she walked the yard and found herself scanning for one particular supervisor before she had even noticed she was doing it. Julia's family had built a piece of their name on the Erie waterfront 2 generations back, shipping interests that had grown quieter over the years, but never disappeared entirely. She had spent her whole career trying to prove she'd earned her position on merit and not on the strength of a surname that opened doors before she'd ever walked through them herself. She rarely brought any of it up with anyone, least of all Megan, who had chosen a smaller, simpler life and never once seemed to resent her sister for choosing differently. The two of them talked about work about as often as they talked about weather in another country. Nathan pressed his collar flat in the bathroom mirror that evening, tugging at a shirt that hadn't seen a hanger in months, and told himself this was just dinner. Nothing more. A favor to a friend. A favor to his daughter. 2 towns over, Julia checked her reflection once, decided it didn't matter either way, and left the house anyway, keys already in her hand before she'd finished deciding. Neither of them had pushed past the first syllable of the other's name. Neither of them expected the one other person in the world already tangled up in their Mondays to be sitting behind it. To understand why Julia said yes to a blind date she barely wanted, you have to understand what 14 months of proving herself had cost her, one careful decision at a time. She had grown up hearing the name Hartman said a certain way in certain rooms, not unkindly, but with an assumption built into it, the assumption that doors would open regardless of what she did to deserve them. Her grandfather had built half the warehouse infrastructure still standing on the Erie waterfront. Her father had expanded it. By the time Julia was old enough to want a career of her own, the name had already written half her resume before she'd typed a single word of it herself. She had spent her 20s overcorrecting for that. Took jobs 2 rungs below what her last name could have gotten her, just to prove the rungs she skipped later had been earned honestly. Worked 80-hour weeks nobody asked her to work, not because the job demanded it, but because she needed, somewhere private and unwitnessed, to know for certain that if the name were stripped away entirely, the competence underneath it would still hold weight. It was exhausting, this quiet, permanent audit she ran on herself. It had also cost her, by her own accounting, most of the ordinary things a life is supposed to accumulate along the way. Friendships that weren't also professional relationships, hobbies that didn't double as networking, any real sense of what she wanted on a Tuesday evening that had nothing to do with a spreadsheet. Megan had never run that same audit. Megan had looked at the family name, decided early it wasn't a debt she owed anyone, and built a small, warm, unremarkable life full of soccer practices and orange slices and a husband who coached Little League badly and happily. Julia envied her sister more than she had ever said out loud, and admired her more than that, and neither of those feelings had ever once curdled into resentment, which was its own kind of rare. So when Megan called with a name and nothing else, Julia said yes, partly out of exhaustion with her own careful architecture, and partly because some small, unaudited part of her, the part that hadn't been allowed to want anything in years without justifying it first, simply wanted to sit across a table from someone who had no idea what her last name was supposed to mean. She had no way of knowing, dressing for that dinner, that the man on the other side of the table already knew exactly who she was. Had known for 14 months. Had reported to her every single Monday, without once treating her name like anything other than a signature on a shift schedule. That, more than the candlelight, more than the bread basket, more than anything either of them said that first night, was the thing that would eventually undo every careful wall Julia Hartman had ever built around herself. The discovery that the one man in Erie who had never once been impressed or intimidated by her name was the same man she had been quietly, professionally, unforgivably unable to stop noticing for over a year. At the restaurant, the silence finally broke on Julia's side of the table. "I almost canceled this 3 times, she said. Not quite a question. Not quite a confession. "I almost didn't come at all," Nathan answered, and something underneath his voice made it clear he meant it as more than a joke. They both let out something that wasn't quite a laugh, more a release of breath either of them had been holding since the hostess said the words "Table 7." The waiter approached again. Julia waved him off with 2 fingers, buying another minute neither of them knew what to do with. 14 months of Monday briefings. Safety walkthroughs. 5-minute conversations over a clipboard in the yard office, where the only thing that ever passed between them was a load number and a nod. None of it had prepared either of them for sitting across a lit candle with nothing between them but a folded napkin and a question neither one wanted to be first to ask out loud. "You read my old report," Nathan said eventually. It wasn't a guess. Something in the way she'd looked at him for the past year had always carried a question underneath it she never actually asked. Julia set her water glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the tablecloth, the way you give your hands something to do when your mouth is about to say something true. Years ago, before Erie, an anonymous filing had crossed her desk, crane inspection findings, the kind of write-up that saves people and never gets a byline attached to it. She studied him across the table now, the candlelight doing nothing to soften the sudden weight in her expression. "I didn't know it was you until I'd been your supervisor for months," she said. Even then, I wasn't sure. I never asked. Why not? Because asking would have meant admitting I'd noticed something I wasn't supposed to notice. Nathan turned his water glass a quarter turn. The way he turned bolts he wasn't ready to loosen yet. Then he told her the rest of it plainly, the way a man tells something he's rehearsed alone in his truck 100 times and never once said out loud to another human being. He had been a licensed structural engineer once, certified on port cranes and load-bearing frameworks. 3 years into a career that mattered in ways his current job never would. His wife, Rachel, had been an engineer too, sharper than him in most rooms, and unafraid to say so, which was one of the 1,000 small reasons he'd married her. She had flagged a fault in a warehouse frame that got overruled by a project manager who wanted the deadline more than he wanted the truth. The frame failed on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Rachel didn't walk away from it. Nathan quit 6 weeks later, packed up an office full of certifications nobody in Erie would ever ask to see, and told himself he was done building things that could kill someone if he got them wrong. I needed something steady, he said. Something where the worst mistake I could make was a late shipment. Not a funeral, even if it meant not using half of what I know. Julia didn't reach for sympathy. Something in his face told her sympathy was the last thing he wanted from anyone tonight, and she'd only known him properly for 11 minutes. Tell me about her, she said instead, meaning Sadie, steering them gently toward something lighter before the silence could turn heavy enough to drown in. Nathan's shoulders eased for the first time all evening. She wants to be a marine biologist this month, he said. Last month it was an astronaut. The month before that, a person who names hurricanes. He shook his head, something almost bright breaking across his face. She's better company than most adults I know. I never had kids, Julia said. Never had time to figure out if I wanted them. Honestly, 14 months in this job, and I've barely had time to figure out if I want a plant. You could start smaller than a kid, Nathan said. A cactus, maybe. Hard to kill. I killed a cactus once. Then I don't know what to tell you. They both laughed, easier this time, and for a moment the restaurant noise around them fell away entirely, just candlelight, and two people who had known each other's work for over a year, finally learning the parts of each other that never made it into a shift report. When he circled back, unprompted, to Rachel a few minutes later, Julia didn't offer sympathy that time either. She reached across the table instead and slid the bread basket an inch closer to him. That was the whole of it. No speech. No careful words. Just a small motion that said she had heard every syllable and wasn't going to make him say more than he already had. Monday, she said finally, standing as the check arrived, smoothing her coat over one arm. We're Miss Hartman and Mr. Griffin again. Both of us. I know how to do my job, Nathan said. I know you do. She hesitated at the door, keys already in hand, looking back at him a second longer than she meant to. That's not what I'm worried about. He watched her walk to her car through the restaurant window and understood exactly what she meant by that. Standing there with his hands in his pockets, he already knew Monday was going to be a great deal harder than either of them had let on over dinner. Before that, though, before the check arrived and the coats came out, there had been a stretch of nearly 40 minutes neither of them would fully describe to anyone afterward, not even to Megan, not even to each other, because some conversations only work if they stay exactly where they happened. Julia had asked him, somewhere between the entree and the second glass of wine neither of them finished, what he thought about most when the yard went quiet. Sadie, he said, without having to think about it. Whether I'm getting it right. Whether she'll remember this version of me or the version before, when her mother was still around to fill in the parts one get wrong. You don't get much wrong, Julia said, and then looked slightly startled at herself for saying it with that much certainty, given that officially, professionally, she had no basis for such a claim beyond 14 months of watching a man coil cable with more care than most people handle their own hands. You've been paying closer attention than a shift schedule requires, Nathan said. It wasn't an accusation. It came out almost gentle, the way you point out something true to someone who's been hoping you would notice and is relieved, underneath the hoping, that you did. Julia turned her wine glass a slow half-turn, an echo of his own habit with the water glass earlier, though neither of them registered the symmetry until much later, replaying the evening the way people replay the parts they weren't ready for at the time. I told myself it was thoroughness, she said. 14 months of telling myself that. I'm very good at telling myself things. What are you telling yourself now? She looked at him for a long moment, the candle between them throwing small movements of light across the tablecloth every time either of them shifted. That I should have asked Megan for a last name after all, she said. Because I would have canceled tonight if I'd known, and I think that would have been the worst mistake I've made in 14 months of trying very hard not to make any. Nathan didn't answer that right away. He let it sit the way he let his stress reading sit before he trusted himself to say what it meant. Then he said quietly, I'm glad you didn't ask her. So am I, Julia said. For exactly as long as this dinner lasts. Ask me again on Monday, and I might tell you something different. I believe you, he said. I'm still glad. It was, on its face, an unremarkable exchange. Two adults admitting a complication out loud instead of pretending it wasn't there. But it was the first time in 3 years Nathan had said the word glad about anything that wasn't Sadie, and some part of him heard himself say it and understood, with the same flat clarity he brought to a stress fracture, that something in his careful architecture had just shifted load in a way he would not be able to fully calculate the cost of for weeks. He drove home the long way, past the terminal gates, past dark warehouse rooftops silhouetted against the last gray light off the lake, and found himself slowing near Crane 4 without quite meaning to, the way a man's foot finds a brake before his mind catches up to why. He hadn't thought about the old work in years without some part of him flinching first. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, the thought arrived quiet instead of sharp. At home, Sadie was already asleep, the babysitter dozing in front of a muted television. He paid her, walked her to her car, and stood on the porch a long while after the taillights disappeared, replaying the small, unremarkable moment of Julia's hand near the bread basket like it was something worth keeping safe. If you were in Nathan's shoes right now, would you ask for a transfer to protect her career? Or would you stay exactly where you were and let the chips fall?
Keep that answer in mind.
You're going to need it. Monday's shift briefing ran 4 minutes longer than usual, and everyone in the room but 2 people thought that was perfectly normal. Nathan stood at the back near the whiteboard, arms crossed, calling out load numbers the way he always did, voice flat, businesslike, unreadable. Julia stood at the front reading off the week's shipping targets in the same even tone she used for board calls, and neither of them looked at the other any longer than a briefing required. It should have been easy. It had been easy, in fact, for 14 months, right up until Friday night changed the math. After the room cleared, Nathan lingered by the door, waiting until the last dock hand had filed out. I could ask for a transfer to the West Dock, he said. Different reporting line. Cleaner for everyone. Julia's pen stopped over her clipboard. Is that what you want? No, he admitted. But I don't want you explaining to the regional board why your safety supervisor took you to dinner 3 days before a crane review. Nobody's explaining anything, Julia said, tighter than she meant to sound. Nothing happened that needs explaining. They both knew that wasn't entirely true. It was true enough to leave the room on, and Nathan did, boots echoing down the corridor toward the yard. Out on the floor, he threw himself into the day's manifests harder than usual, double-checking work he normally trusted on the first pass, as if enough paperwork could crowd out the memory of candlelight and a bread basket. A dock hand asked him twice if he was feeling all right. He said he was fine both times, and neither answer sounded convincing. In her office that afternoon, Julia pulled his personnel file from the archive, not the thin summary sheet HR kept on hand for scheduling, but the full record, the one with his old engineering license number still listed under prior credentials, because nobody had ever bothered to update it. She had read it twice before, in the detached, procedural way a director reads any file. She read it a third time that afternoon, and caught herself lingering on details she'd skimmed past without really seeing them. 2 commendations. A resignation letter exactly 3 lines long. No explanation attached to any of it. She closed the folder before she could let herself read it a 4th time. She had spent 14 months keeping exactly the right distance from Nathan Griffin, measuring it out carefully, like a woman balancing something fragile down a flight of stairs. One dinner, and the distance had a crack running through it she couldn't quite plaster back over, no matter how many files she reread or how many times she told herself Monday would fix it. She caught herself late that evening, standing at her office window looking down at the empty yard, Crane 4's outline dark against the dusk, and asked herself honestly whether the extra hours she'd been logging at this terminal for 14 months had ever really been about the shipping numbers at all. She didn't have an answer she liked. So she turned off the light and went home instead of sitting with it any longer. By Wednesday, Julia found herself on the yard floor more than her own calendar called for, watching Nathan work the way she hadn't let herself watch before. Not for competence, she already knew he had that in spades. For the smaller things underneath it. The way he double-checked a cable clamp that had already passed inspection an hour earlier. The way he crouched down to a younger dock hand's eye level to explain a mistake instead of barking it across the yard. The way half the supervisors did. Todd Bishop noticed her noticing. Bishop had been vice president of operations at Great Lakes Freight for 6 years, and 14 months ago he had been the internal favorite for the regional director job that went to Julia instead, a decision he had smiled through in the announcement meeting and complained about privately to anyone who'd listened ever since. "You're spending a lot of hours down here for a director," Bishop said, falling into step beside her near Crane 4, hands in his pockets, tone almost friendly. "People talk, you know." "People should talk about load schedules," Julia said, not slowing her pace. Bishop let it go outwardly, but his eyes tracked toward Nathan coiling cable near the loading platform, and something in his expression settled into a coldness that had nothing to do with schedules at all. He'd spent 6 years telling himself the director job would eventually come around to him, that Julia's appointment was a temporary correction the board would reverse once she stumbled. 14 months in, she hadn't stumbled once. And watching her linger near a yard supervisor felt, to Bishop, like the first crack he'd been waiting for. Proof he could use eventually if he was patient enough to wait for the right moment.
He was a patient man.
That should worry you more than it worried Julia at the time. To understand exactly how patient, you have to understand what 6 years of almost had done to Todd Bishop. He had joined Great Lakes Freight as a floor supervisor at 26, the same age Nathan had been when he'd walked away from structural engineering entirely, though the two men could not have arrived at their careers from more different directions. Bishop had never built anything. He had managed the building of things, which he had always privately considered the harder job, the job that required understanding people instead of merely understanding steel, and he resented, more than he ever said out loud, that the world tended to hand its praise to the people who welded the joints instead of the people who kept the welding on schedule and under budget. He had watched 3 regional directors come and go in his time at the company, had positioned himself carefully under each of them, had made himself indispensable in the particular quiet way that men do when they are betting on outlasting everyone above them rather than out-arguing them. When the 4th directorship opened up, he had been certain, genuinely, not merely hopefully certain, that it belonged to him. He had the tenure. He had the relationships. He had spent 6 years building exactly the kind of quiet, competent reputation that boards were supposed to reward. The board had given it to a 34-year-old woman from a shipping family instead, and Bishop had smiled through the announcement meeting the way a man smiles when smiling is the only tool left in the box, and had gone home that night and sat in his car in his own driveway for 11 minutes before he could make himself go inside and pretend to his wife that the day had gone fine. He told himself, in the months that followed, that it wasn't personal. That Julia Hartman was simply a name the board wanted attached to a difficult year, a symbolic hire meant to signal something to shareholders about the company's future that had nothing to do with actual competence. He told himself this so many times that by the time 14 months had passed and she had not stumbled once, had, if anything, tighten the Erie operation in ways his own tenure never quite managed. The story he had built for himself no longer matched the evidence in front of him, and a man who has told himself a story for over a year does not easily let the facts talk him out of it. The maintenance deferrals had started small, and Bishop had never once, in his own accounting, thought of them as dangerous. A quarter here, a visual inspection standing in for a load test there. Numbers that needed trimming before a board review, the kind of decisions operations men made everywhere, the kind nobody thanked you for, and nobody questioned either, as long as nothing broke. Nothing had broken for 2 years. That was the thing about the particular kind of corner-cutting Bishop specialized in. It did not announce itself as recklessness. It announced itself as prudence, as cost discipline, as the unglamorous competence that never made it into a 2-paragraph newspaper item, right up until the exact moment it did. Watching Julia linger near Nathan Griffin that Wednesday afternoon, Bishop had felt something click into place that he mistook, at the time, for opportunity rather than what it actually was, which was the last domino in a chain he had been quietly building for 2 years without ever fully admitting to himself where it led. He did not think of himself as a man capable of endangering anyone. He thought of himself as a man who had been overlooked and who had finally found the thread that might unravel the woman who'd overlooked him. It would take a groan of failing steel, 6 feet of sudden drop, and the flat, urgent voice of a man he dismissed as a forklift supervisor to show him the difference between those two men, and by then, it would already be far too late for the difference to save him. At noon, Nathan's phone buzzed with a video call from Sadie, homesick that day with nothing worse than a cold, holding up a drawing of a sailboat on Lake Erie done in careful, uneven crayon strokes. "I gave it 3 sails," she said, tilting the paper toward the camera. "Real boats only have 2, but 3 looks better." "Breeze is better," Nathan agreed, smiling in a way the yard never saw from him. Later that afternoon, when the same call cut short because a load needed his attention, he found Julia already waiting by the loading gate with 2 coffees, one held out toward him before he'd said a word about needing it. "You looked like you skipped lunch," she said, like it was nothing. Like she hadn't been watching for the exact moment he'd need it. He took the cup and didn't ask how she knew. Neither of them mentioned that supervisors didn't usually bring coffee to anyone. Julia had heard the tail end of the call with Sadie before she'd walked over. The unguarded warmth in his voice, a register she had never once heard him use in 14 months of briefings. She filed it away the same careful way she'd filed everything else about him. Except this time, she let herself hold on to it a little longer before moving on down the row. That same week, Bishop quietly signed off on a maintenance deferral for Crane 4, pushing its full inspection back another quarter to trim the department's cost report before Friday's regional numbers went out. It wasn't the first time he'd done it. He'd been doing it in smaller, careful doses for close to 2 years, long before Julia ever arrived in Erie, and her arrival hadn't changed a habit nobody above him had ever thought to check closely. He signed the form standing up, coffee in one hand, the way a man signs something he stopped thinking of as a decision at all. Somewhere on that same crane, a stress fracture that nobody had looked at closely enough was getting 1 week closer to becoming something else entirely. Nathan noticed the deferral 2 days later while cross-referencing the week's equipment logs, a habit left over from a career he supposedly didn't practice anymore. He flagged it to the floor supervisor, who shrugged and said Bishop's office had already cleared it. Nathan let it sit for a day, uneasy, before deciding it was worth raising with Julia directly. Julia called an informal technical review the following Monday. No agenda circulated in advance. Just Nathan, Bishop, and 2 engineers from the regional office gathered around a set of maintenance logs in a conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner. She hadn't needed a manufactured excuse to bring Nathan into the room. 14 months of trusting his read on the yard had already made that decision for her, long before Friday ever happened. The 2 regional engineers, a quiet man named Douglas and a younger woman fresh out of a certification program, spread the inspection photos across the table without much ceremony, expecting a routine sign-off. Nathan pulled the third photo back toward himself before anyone else had finished with the first. He flagged the crane's force connector joint in under 10 minutes, pointing to a stress pattern in the inspection photos that the official report hadn't mentioned at all, not even in passing. "This isn't wear from load cycling," he said, sliding the photo across the table. "This is fatigue. It needs a full teardown, not a patch job and a signature. We patched it in the spring," Bishop cut in, voice sharper now. "It passed a visual," Nathan said evenly. "Not a load test. Those are two different things, and you know it." Bishop's voice climbed half a register, color rising in his neck. "I don't need a forklift supervisor rewriting engineering assessments in front of the regional office." "He's not rewriting anything," Julia said, calm and final, closing the folder in front of her. "He's reading it correctly, which is more than I can say for whoever signed off on this last spring. Schedule the teardown for this week. Full stop." Bishop agreed out loud and disagreed with every muscle in his face. He gathered his folder and left first, and in the doorway he glanced back at Julia a beat too long, the look of a man already deciding how he'd use this later, filing it away the same careful way she'd once filed Nathan. Douglas lingered after the room cleared, gathering the loose photos into a neat stack. "He's not wrong about the cost," he said quietly, meaning Bishop. "But he's definitely wrong about the joint." Julia thanked him and said nothing else, already thinking 3 steps ahead to the shutdown order she'd need to sign before the week was out. "Guess what happens next before you keep reading? Would you have trusted the numbers on the page? Or the man who'd been signing off on them for years without question?" Erie was about to find out the hard way which one deserved that trust. That night, well past midnight, a warning alarm sounded on Crane 4's control panel for 11 full seconds before it cut off on its own. The graveyard crew barely registered it over the wind coming off the lake, and nobody logged the incident in the shift report. By the time the morning shift clocked in, the alarm history showed nothing at all, as if it had never gone off in the first place. Nathan heard about it secondhand from a dockhand smoking near the gate, and something about the way the man described it didn't sit right with him at all. He went looking for the one person in the yard who had been there longer than the alarm system itself. Walt Sanborn had run the yard crew at Great Lakes Freight for 31 years, with 6 months left before retirement, a date he counted down out loud more often than anyone cared to hear. He kept a small spiral notebook in his jacket pocket that nobody had ever asked to see, mostly because nobody remembered it existed at all. "You didn't hear this from me," Walt said, sliding the notebook across a workbench in the equipment shed, voice low even though they were alone. "But I've been keeping my own log since Bishop started asking me to sign inspection sheets for work I never actually did. 3 times over 2 years. I always meant to say something. Kept telling myself I'd say it after I retired. Once it couldn't cost me my pension." The shed smelled like grease and cold metal, one bare bulb swinging faintly overhead every time a truck rumbled past outside. Nathan flipped through pages of dates and initials, cross-referenced against maintenance records that told a much cleaner story than the truth ever had. "Why tell me now, Walt?" "Because you're the only one who ever looked twice at that crane and didn't stop looking." Walt closed the notebook gently, like it was something fragile. "I trust you'll do something with it. I never had the nerve myself." Nathan drove straight to Julia's house that night, notebook in hand, headlights cutting through fog rolling in off the lake, radio off, the whole drive silent except for the wipers clearing a fine mist off the windshield. He didn't rehearse what he'd say. Some things didn't need rehearsing anymore. She opened the door in a coat thrown over pajamas, immediately alert at the sight of his face. He didn't come in as a man who'd taken her to dinner 4 days earlier. He came in as an engineer who had already lost someone once to a report nobody wanted to hear. They sat at her kitchen table until 2 in the morning, cross-checking Walt's notes against 2 years of maintenance filings, coffee going cold between them. And somewhere around the 40th page, Julia looked up at him and understood, fully, without a shred of doubt left, that Every instinct she'd trusted about this man for 14 months had been earned. Never imagined. "I'm pulling Crane 4 offline first thing," she said, closing the notebook. "Full shutdown. Full inspection before another shift so much as touches it." "Bishop won't like that." "Bishop doesn't get a vote," Julia said. And for the first time all night, something in her voice sounded almost steady again. "You'd think that would be the end of it. Evidence gathered. Shutdown ordered. Problem solved before it could become a tragedy. You'd be wrong. Because paperwork moves slower than a man protecting a number he badly needs by Friday." The following morning, before Julia's shutdown order reached the floor supervisor, Bishop pushed through an early departure for a scheduled freighter, overriding the delay himself to protect a quarterly number he needed in front of the regional board that Friday. Nathan was midway across the yard, coffee in hand, when he heard it, a groan of metal too sharp and too sudden to be routine, coming from Crane 4's main connector joint. He didn't think. He ran, shouting the evacuation call before his brain had fully processed what his ears already knew, waving two dock hands clear of the swing radius seconds before the load shifted overhead. Dust sifted down from the joint in a fine gray curtain, catching the morning light for half a second before the crack widened. The joint gave with a groan that echoed off the warehouse walls, the boom dropping 6 feet before the emergency brake finally caught it, cargo swinging wide over empty concrete instead of over anyone's head. Nathan was already calling out shutdown sequences before the dust had settled, directing the crew with the flat, exact voice of a man who had spent years training for precisely this kind of second. Nobody was hurt. Nobody came anywhere close. Julia arrived at a dead run, breath ragged, coat unbuttoned, and found Nathan standing at the base of the crane, hands still shaking slightly at his sides, staring up at the bent connector joint like it was a wound he recognized on sight. She didn't say anything about the last 4 days. Didn't say anything at all at first. She looked at what he'd just done and understood, watching him work through the aftermath, that she had never actually seen the full shape of what he used to be until this exact moment, on this exact morning. Bishop reached the scene minutes later, already talking, already assembling the story he needed. "Equipment failure," he said, spreading his hands. "These things happen. We'll file it as a mechanical fault and move forward." "It's not a mechanical fault," Nathan said, turning to face him fully. "It's a maintenance record you falsified twice and a shutdown order you overrode this morning to protect a shipping number." Bishop's face cycled through 3 expressions before settling on outrage. "That's a serious accusation from a forklift supervisor." "He's not a forklift supervisor," Julia said, stepping between them, voice carrying across the yard. "He's the only reason nobody's in an ambulance right now. Walt's notebook is already on my desk, Todd. So is your shutdown override, time-stamped an hour before this happened." For the first time since Julia had known him, Bishop had nothing ready to say back. Later that afternoon, after the site had been cleared and the incident report filed, Julia found Nathan sitting on the tailgate of a maintenance truck, elbows on his knees, hands finally steady, but his face still pale under the yard lights. She didn't say anything about the report or the board or Bishop. She sat down next to him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and let the quiet do what neither of them had the words for yet. "It's the second time," Nathan said eventually. "First time I couldn't stop it. This time I could." Julia didn't tell him it wasn't the same. It wasn't, and they both knew it, and some things didn't need saying out loud to be true. Between the crane groaning under a weight it should never have carried, and the board convening to decide what to do about the man who'd overridden the shutdown order, there were 2 days that neither Nathan nor Julia ever spoke about publicly, and that neither of them needed to, because some days simply belonged to the people who lived them. On the first of those 2 days, Julia drove to Nathan's house after her own shift ended, unannounced, still in her work clothes, and found him in the driveway with Sadie, the two of them bent over a bicycle chain that had come loose, Sadie narrating the repair with far more confidence than her actual mechanical skill warranted. "You're doing it wrong," Sadie informed her father, with the flat authority of a 9-year-old who has recently learned the word torque and intends to use it as often as possible. "I'm doing it exactly the way the internet told me to," Nathan said. "The internet is wrong." Julia stood at the end of the driveway for a moment before either of them noticed her, watching the two of them argue gently over a bicycle chain in the fading light, and felt something in her chest that she did not have a tidy word for yet, something adjacent to longing, but not quite that, something closer to recognition. As if she were looking at a version of ordinary life she hadn't known she'd been missing until she saw it happening in someone else's driveway. "You're staring," Sadie said, without looking up, in the same flat tone she'd used on the bicycle chain. "I am," Julia admitted, because there was no version of lying to this particular child that seemed likely to succeed. "Are you the boss lady?"
Sadie asked.
"I'm the boss lady," Julia confirmed. Sadie considered this with the seriousness she gave everything. "Dad's been weird since Friday," she said. "Weird good, I think. Not weird bad. I wanted to make sure." "Sadie," Nathan said, in the particular tone of a parent who has just been publicly, accurately diagnosed by his own child and has no defense prepared.
"What?"
"You have been," Sadie said, entirely unbothered, and went back to the bicycle chain. Julia laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she hadn't let herself have in a boardroom or a yard office in longer than she wanted to admit, and Nathan looked up at the sound of it with an expression that had nothing careful left in it at all. They did not talk that evening about Bishop, or the maintenance logs, or the shutdown order sitting and signed on Julia's desk. They talked about bicycle chains and about a marine biology documentary Sadie had strong opinions about, and about nothing in particular for almost 2 hours, and it was, Julia would think much later, one of the best 2 hours she had spent in 14 months of very carefully accounted for time. On the second of those 2 days, the alarm sounded on Crane 4 for 11 seconds that nobody logged, and the ordinary shape of things came apart, and there would not be another evening like that one for several weeks. Not because anything between them had broken, but because the version of Nathan and Julia that existed inside a driveway argument about bicycle chains had to step aside, briefly, for the version that existed inside a falsified maintenance record and a groan of failing steel. But it mattered that the driveway evening had happened before the crane, not after. It meant that when everything else fell apart 2 days later, both of them already knew, underneath the crisis, exactly what they were trying to protect. The regional board convened an emergency session 2 days later, and Julia walked in with Walt's notebook, the falsified inspection sheets, Nathan's technical report, and the crane's own maintenance history laid out in a folder thick enough to end most arguments. Before they started, Bishop tried anyway. He arrived in a suit sharper than the ones he usually wore to routine reviews, a small detail Julia noticed and filed away without comment, the way she noticed everything now, the way the last 2 weeks had taught her to. A man dressing for a fight he intends to win looks different from a man dressing for a meeting he expects to survive, and Bishop, walking into that boardroom, had clearly decided this was the former. He spent the first 10 minutes attacking the credibility of the evidence itself, questioning Walt's memory, questioning whether a yard supervisor with no current engineering license had any standing to override a signed inspection at all. He called Walt's notebook the diary of a disgruntled employee counting down to his pension, a phrase he had clearly rehearsed, delivered with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 6 years learning exactly which words landed hardest in a boardroom. 31 years of service, Julia said, when he paused for effect, and this is the first time anyone has questioned Walt Sanborn's memory. "I find that timing interesting, Todd."
"Do you?"
Bishop did not answer that directly. He shifted instead to the maintenance filings themselves, arguing that a 2-year pattern of deferrals was standard cost management across the entire regional fleet, that singling out Crane 4's paperwork amounted to a witch hunt built on a personal relationship rather than genuine safety concern, that any competent operations officer would recognize routine budget discipline when they saw it. The board chair let him finish without interruption, the way a good chair lets a man talk himself into a corner. Then, when that line failed to land, Bishop pivoted to attacking the people who'd gathered the evidence in the first place. I think it's worth asking, he said, looking directly at Julia across the long table, how objective this whole investigation really is, given that our regional director had dinner with this particular supervisor last Friday. People downtown saw them together. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone has said something true and ugly in the same breath. Julia didn't flinch. She let the silence sit for exactly as long as she needed it to. I had dinner with a man I didn't know worked for me until I sat down across the table from him, she said evenly, meeting every eye in the room one at a time. What I'm presenting today is a connector joint that failed under load, 2 years of falsified inspection reports, and a shutdown order you personally overrode yesterday morning to protect a number on a spreadsheet. None of that has anything to do with where I ate dinner on a Friday night. If you'd like to discuss my personal life instead of the safety of this yard, Todd, I'm happy to let the board decide right now which one of us should actually be answering questions today. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then the board chair asked Bishop to leave the room, and the vote to suspend him pending a full investigation took less than 5 minutes to close. Bishop did not go quietly. At the door, he turned back one last time, and for a moment the practiced calm slipped entirely, revealing something rawer underneath it. Not quite an apology, not quite a threat, something closer to the bewildered fury of a man who genuinely believed, until the very last second, that patience and tenure were owed a different ending than the one he'd just been handed. 6 years, he said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to all of them at once. 6 years, and it comes down to a forklift supervisor and a spiral notebook. It comes down to 2 years of falsified signatures and a shutdown order you overrode to protect a number, the board chair said, not unkindly, but without any give in it either. The notebook just happened to be the thing that finally made it impossible to look away from. Bishop left without another word. Nobody in that room ever saw him again, though his name would surface once more, quietly, in an audit 2 years later, the last small echo of a man who had spent 6 years waiting to be seen and had finally succeeded in exactly the way he'd least intended. Before the meeting adjourned, the same board offered Nathan a newly created position, Regional Safety and Structural Advisor, full authority to review every crane and frame in the district. A role built almost entirely around the exact expertise he'd spent 3 years trying to walk quietly away from. He didn't answer right away. He looked at Julia first, and she gave him nothing but a small, steady nod, the kind that said the choice was entirely his to make, and she'd respect whatever he decided either way. I'll take it, Nathan said finally. On one condition. Every inspection gets a name attached to it from now on. No more anonymous reports nobody has to answer for later. The board agreed, without argument. Walking out of the boardroom, Julia fell into step beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for the first time all week, neither of them worried about who was watching. You didn't have to take it, she said quietly. I know, Nathan said. I wanted to. That's different. She let that sit between them the rest of the walk to the elevator, and it felt, for the first time since the crane joint had cracked, like something settling back into place instead of coming apart. That weekend, Megan called Julia's cell while flipping through the Erie paper's local section over breakfast. A short 2-paragraph item about a dockyard crane failure narrowly avoided, crediting terminal supervisor Nathan Griffin by name for the quick call that kept anyone from getting hurt. Nathan Griffin, Megan said slowly, the paper still open in front of her. Julia, that's not the guy from the soccer bleachers, is it? Julia let the silence answer for her a second too long to pass as nothing. You've got to be kidding me, Megan said. You've known him this whole time. You let me set up a blind date with someone who already works for you, and you said nothing? I didn't know his last name when you called, Julia said. Neither did you, apparently, or you'd have said something first. They met at Megan's kitchen table 2 days later, all 3 of them, and Megan spent the first 10 minutes somewhere between stunned and genuinely offended before it tipped slowly into something closer to relief than anger. 14 months, she said, shaking her head at both of them across the table. You two worked together for 14 months, and neither of you ever said a single word to me about it. I didn't tell you what I do for a living, Julia admitted, because I wanted you to like me for something other than my title. Even you. Even my own sister, and I don't talk about the job I used to have, Nathan said, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands, because it's the last thing I ever built with my wife. I wasn't ready to hand that story to anyone at the bleachers. Not even to someone I liked as much as you. Megan looked at them both a long moment, then laughed, short, disbelieving, shaking her head at herself now instead of them. So, I didn't actually set anyone up at all, she said. I just finally forced the two of you to say it out loud. You did more than that, Julia said. You were right about him before either of us was ready to admit it. Megan pointed a fork at her sister. I'm always right. You two just take longer than most people to catch up. Nathan laughed for real that time, the first easy laugh either woman had heard from him all afternoon, and Megan seemed to file that away too, satisfied, like she'd finally gotten the reaction she'd been fishing for since the bleachers. Sadie met Julia properly a week later, at a lakeside picnic table, in a moment Nathan hadn't planned quite as carefully as it looked from the outside. She studied Julia with the frank, unhurried attention only a 9-year-old can manage without any self-consciousness at all. Do you like boats? Sadie asked, swinging her legs under the table. I like people who take care of them, Julia said, and meant it in more ways than the girl understood yet, glancing sideways at Nathan as she said it. Sadie considered that answer with the seriousness of a much older person, then slid her drawing across the table without being asked. You can have this one, she said. I already made a better one. Julia folded it carefully and put it in her bag instead of her pocket, the way a person keeps something they intend to hold on to for longer than an afternoon. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Bishop was formally terminated following the investigation's findings, and Nathan started his new role with a badge that carried his real title on it for the first time in 3 years. On a Friday evening that felt deliberately unremarkable, he and Julia found themselves back at the same restaurant, both of them asking for the same table without either one saying so out loud first. The hostess seated them at table 7 without a second thought, as though it had always been reserved for exactly this.
Candlelight.
The same low hum of conversation from the next table. The same waiter, older now by 3 weeks and nothing else. Julia noticed all of it and said none of it out loud, content just to let the evening repeat itself on purpose this time. There was no grand declaration between them. There didn't need to be one anymore. Julia set her hand flat on the white tablecloth, the same gesture from the first night, except this time it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a question either. Nathan looked at it for a moment. 3 years since he'd let himself reach for anything without calculating the cost first. And then he covered her hand with his, steady, unhurried, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying a long way without ever once setting it down. Outside, the lake wind picked up faintly against the window. The same wind that had carried fog to Julia's porch the night Nathan showed up with Walt's notebook. The same wind that came off Crane 4 every morning at shift change. Neither of them mentioned any of it. They didn't need to. It was simply there now, part of the ordinary weather of their life together. No longer something either of them had to brace against. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. A text from Megan. Asterisk Sadie's asleep at my place. Don't rush back. Finish your dinner for once in your life. Asterisk he read it, smiled, and put the phone away without checking it again. It had taken them 14 months to stop being strangers to each other in every way that mattered. And one poorly kept secret from a well-meaning sister to finally stop pretending they still were. It is worth pausing here, before the yard settles into its long, ordinary quiet, to consider Megan Hartman one more time, not as a footnote, but as the actual origin point of everything that followed, a woman who cornered a tired father by a set of bleachers because she genuinely believed he deserved one good evening he hadn't scheduled 6 weeks in advance. Megan never set out to matchmake her own sister. She did not know, that afternoon by the soccer field, that the name she offered so casually, his name's Nathan, that's all you get, belonged to a man her sister had been quietly failing not to notice for over a year. She was, in the truest sense, an accident of good intentions, the kind of accident this story keeps returning to again and again, as if trying to prove a single point from every possible angle, that the biggest turns in a life rarely announce themselves as anything other than ordinary favors between friends. If Megan had known the two of them already worked together, she likely never would have made the call at all, assuming, reasonably, that two people who saw each other every Monday had already decided whatever there was to decide between them. It was precisely her not knowing, her working with incomplete information, her simple, unglamorous act of caring about a tired friend and a busy sister in equal measure, that forced two people to finally say out loud what 14 months of careful professionalism had kept them from admitting even to themselves. There is a version of this story where Nathan says no a third time, where Sadie doesn't throw his own advice back at him while tying her cleats, where Julia asks for a last name after all and cancels before ever getting in the car. In that version, Bishop's deferrals continue quietly for another year, maybe two, until a joint fails on a morning nobody is prepared for, with nobody standing close enough or paying close enough attention to shout the evacuation call in time. That version of the story is the one this whole account exists to make you grateful never happened. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a shipping yard after 5 o'clock, once the last truck has rolled through the gate and the overhead lights click on one row at a time, humming faintly against a sky already going gray at the edges. Nathan still walks that yard some evenings, long after his shift technically ends, the way a man walks past a house he used to live in, not because he needs to, but because some part of him will always check. He still slows near Crane 4 without meaning to. He doesn't flinch anymore. That, more than the title on his badge or the framed board resolution in his new office, is the thing that tells him something actually healed instead of just closing over. Julia joins him some of those evenings, coffee in hand, not because the yard needs a director walking it at 7 p.m., but because she has stopped pretending the extra hours were ever really about the shipping numbers. They don't talk about Bishop much anymore. There isn't much left to say about a man who spent 6 years waiting for someone else to fail and never once considered that the failing might be his own. They don't talk about the crane joint either, not directly. But sometimes Julia will reach out and rest her palm flat against the cold steel of the loading platform railing, the same unhurried gesture from that second dinner at table 7, and Nathan understands it as its own kind of sentence, one that doesn't need finishing out loud. Walt retired on schedule, 6 months almost to the day from when he first slid that spiral notebook across a workbench in the equipment shed. Nathan drove him to the retirement dinner himself, and somewhere between the appetizers and the gold watch nobody actually wanted, Walt leaned over and said the only thing he'd ever say about the whole affair. "Knew you'd do something with it," he said. "Didn't know it'd end with you running my old job better than I ever did." "You gave me the notebook," Nathan said. "That's the part that mattered." "Notebooks don't run into burning buildings, son," Walt said. "You did." Nathan didn't correct him about the building. Some metaphors earn the right to stay slightly wrong. Go back, for a moment, to the question this story asked you at the very beginning, before you knew any of the rest of it. If the person your boss had been quietly watching for over a year turned out to be the same person your best friend swore was your soulmate, would you sit down? Nathan sat down. Not because he was certain of anything. Not because the math made sense yet. He sat down because his daughter had thrown his own advice back at him, and because some part of him, buried under 3 years of careful routine, was tired of being the only variable in his life he refused to change. Julia let him sit down too. Not because she'd planned it, and certainly not because 14 months of professional distance had prepared her for candlelight and a bread basket. She let it happen because some part of her, the part that kept finding reasons to walk the yard at odd hours, had already decided, long before Friday, that this particular variable was worth the risk to her own careful math. That is the real story underneath the crane, underneath the boardroom, underneath Bishop's falsified signatures and Walt's spiral notebook and the 11-second alarm nobody logged. It is the story of two people who had each built a version of safety out of distance, Nathan through routine, Julia through professional restraint, and who discovered, almost by accident, that the safest thing either of them ever did was let a table for two undo 14 months of careful math in a single evening. Rachel would have liked her, Nathan thinks sometimes, standing at the yard fence at dusk, watching Julia walk the last row of containers with a clipboard she doesn't actually need to be carrying anymore. He has never said this out loud to anyone, not even to Julia. Some things you carry quietly, because carrying them quietly is its own kind of honoring. But he thinks it anyway most evenings, right around the time the lights click on across the yard one row at a time, and the wind comes up off the lake the way it always does, carrying with it the same particular cold that once carried him, notebook in hand, to a porch light he didn't know yet would become the center of the rest of his life. Sadie asked him once, not long after that lakeside picnic table, whether he was going to marry Julia. He told her some things take longer to build than a boat with 3 sails, and that the extra sail was still, in his professional opinion, doing all the work. Sadie considered this with the same seriousness she gave everything, then went back to her drawing without further comment, apparently satisfied that the answer, eventually, would be yes. She was right about that too. Everyone in this story, it turns out, was more right than they gave themselves credit for. Megan about the two of them, Walt about the crane, Sadie about her father, and Julia about the man she had been quietly, carefully, professionally not noticing for 14 months before a wrong table number at a small restaurant in Erie finally forced the truth to sit down across from both of them at once. The joint on Crane 4 was replaced within the month. Full teardown. Full recertification. Nathan's name on the inspection sheet, the way he'd asked for it. No more anonymous reports nobody had to answer for. It has held every single day since. Some things, once they're finally built the right way, simply do. And if there's a name that comes to mind right now, someone who showed up for you exactly when you needed them to, even if neither of you understood yet what it would become, say it. Just their name. Nothing else. Because sometimes the most important tables in a person's life are the ones nobody planned to be seated at. Table 7 was never really about the number. It was about who finally sat down. There is a version of this story the regional board filed away in a folder marked closed, and there is the version that actually happened, and the two overlap almost entirely except for the parts that mattered most to the two people living through it. The board's version ends with a suspension, an investigation, a termination, and a promotion. Clean lines. A cost-benefit analysis with a satisfying conclusion. Bishop's name removed from the org chart. Nathan's name added to a new one. Case closed, minutes filed. Next agenda item. What the board never saw was the 6 weeks that followed, when Nathan came home some nights still carrying the particular exhaustion of a man learning to trust his own expertise again after 3 years of deliberately not using it. Some evenings he sat at the kitchen table long after Sadie was asleep, old certification manuals spread out in front of him, relearning load calculations he had once known cold and had spent 3 years trying to forget he'd ever known at all. Julia found him like that more than once, letting herself in with a spare key he'd given her without either of them making a formal occasion out of the giving, and she never once offered to help with the calculations, because she understood, without him having to explain it, that this particular relearning was something he needed to do with his own hands, the way you reteach a muscle after an injury, slowly, and without an audience rushing the recovery. What she did instead was make tea neither of them particularly wanted, and sit across the table doing her own paperwork, and let the silence between them be the kind that didn't need filling. It was, in its own way, the same gift he had given her that first Monday morning at the loading gate, coffee held out before she'd said a word about needing it. Presents, offered without conditions attached. The board never saw any of that. The board saw a technically sound structural advisor with impeccable credentials and a clean disciplinary record, doing exactly the job they'd hired him to do. They had no way of knowing that every load calculation Nathan signed his name to in those first months carried, Underneath the math, the ghost of a warehouse frame that had failed on an ordinary Tuesday 3 years earlier, and a silent promise he made to Rachel every single time he double-checked a number twice instead of once. A year and some months after the blind date that wasn't really a blind date at all, Megan stood up at her own daughter's birthday party. Not a wedding, nothing that formal, just a backyard full of soccer families and a cake shaped badly like a soccer ball, and made an announcement she had clearly been waiting months to make. "I want it on record," she said, tapping a plastic fork against her lemonade glass until the yard quieted down enough to hear her, "that I am the reason these two are together." "You are not," Julia said, laughing, from somewhere near the picnic table. "I absolutely am," Megan said. "I found him. I vetted him. I personally guilt-tripped him into going to that dinner, and then I found out 3 days later that my own sister had been secretly in love with my dinner guest for over a year and told nobody, which I have chosen, out of the goodness of my heart, to forgive." "I wasn't secretly in love with him," Julia said, though the protest came out considerably weaker than it might have a year and some months earlier. "You brought him coffee before he knew he needed it," Megan said. "That's not a director-employee relationship. That's the opening scene of a movie." Nathan, standing near the grill with Sadie leaning against his side, said nothing, but the look on his face did most of the talking Megan needed for her point to land with the whole yard. "Anyway," Megan said, raising her lemonade glass properly now, "to wrong last names, poorly kept secrets, and sisters who are always right, even when nobody wants to admit it at the time. You're never going to let this go, are you?" Julia said. "Never," Megan confirmed, entirely without regret. "I'm framing the newspaper clipping. Both paragraphs. There is one more piece of this story worth knowing, one that neither the board nor Megan nor even Sadie ever saw, because Nathan kept it in the same box in the garage where his old commendations lived, unframed, beside a letter he had started writing to Rachel 3 years earlier and had never finished, because some letters aren't meant to be finished so much as carried. The night after the board meeting, once Sadie was asleep and the house had gone quiet in the particular way houses go quiet after a day too large to fully process, Nathan sat at the kitchen table and wrote a second letter. The way he had once told Julia, he thought better with a pen in his hand than with words spoken out loud. He did not send it to anyone. He did not, in fact, entirely know who it was for, Rachel or Julia, or some future version of Sadie old enough to understand it, or simply himself, working something loose that had been stuck for 3 years and had finally, that week, begun to move. He wrote that he was sorry it had taken a stranger's dinner reservation and a near catastrophe on a crane he used to be terrified to even look at directly to remind him that building things, trusting his own hands and his own math again, was not a betrayal of the life he'd lost. It was, if anything, the truest way he knew how to honor it. He wrote that Rachel would have liked Julia, not because Julia was anything like her, but because Julia had the same particular stubbornness about doing a hard job honestly, the same refusal to let a convenient lie sit uncorrected simply because correcting it was inconvenient for someone with more power in the room. He wrote that Sadie was going to be fine, better than fine, that the sailboat with 3 sails, in Sadie's own words, looked better than the real thing, and that he had come, slowly, to believe his daughter might simply understand something about the world that had taken her father 3 long years and 1 falling crane joint to relearn, that the extra sail, the unnecessary risk, the thing you didn't strictly need, was sometimes exactly the thing that made the whole boat worth building in the first place. He folded the letter in thirds, the way Rachel used to fold grocery lists, and put it in the box with the commendations, and did not read it again for a long time. Some things you write down not because you need to send them anywhere, but because writing them down is the only way to know for certain that you actually believe them. 2 years after a hostess seated 2 strangers at table 7 without either one asking for it, the same restaurant added a small brass plate to that particular table, at the quiet, persistent request of a regular customer who came in often enough that the staff had stopped pretending not to notice the pattern. The plate did not say anything dramatic. It simply read reserved, though the restaurant had never actually reserved that table for anyone in a formal sense. It was Julia's idea, and Nathan had teased her mercilessly about it for a week before admitting, quietly, that he liked walking in and seeing it there. Some proof, small and unglamorous, that a table could hold more history than the wood it was built from. Sadie, 11 now and between marine biologist and something called a forensic entomologist she'd discovered from a documentary she probably shouldn't have watched unsupervised, had taken to calling Julia's apartment her other kitchen, a phrase that arrived without ceremony one ordinary Tuesday and simply stayed, the way the truest words in a family often do. Walt sent a postcard from Florida every few months, usually a picture of a fishing boat, always with the same closing line scrawled at the bottom in handwriting that had gotten shakier but no less certain. Still glad I gave you the notebook. Douglas, the quiet engineer from the regional office, had transferred to Erie permanently within the year, citing, in his transfer request, a professional interest in working alongside the only supervisor in this district who reads a stress fracture correctly on the first pass, which Nathan found more flattering than he let on and Julia found entirely unsurprising. Bishop's name came up rarely, and only ever in the smallest, most practical ways, a line item in an old file, a signature on a maintenance record that got flagged and corrected during a routine audit 2 years later, the last quiet echo of a man who had spent 6 years waiting to be seen and had finally, catastrophically, succeeded in exactly the way he had least intended. And Crane 4, repaired and recertified and inspected now with a name attached to every single sign-off, still stood at the edge of the yard, swinging its ordinary loads over its ordinary hours, indistinguishable to anyone who didn't know its history from any other piece of steel on the waterfront. But Nathan still slowed near it sometimes, out of habit more than fear now, the way you slow near any place that once asked something enormous of you and got it. And some evenings, Julia slowed there too, without either of them planning to meet, and they would stand together for a minute in the particular quiet of a yard after 5 o'clock, not saying anything, because by then there was very little left between them that still needed saying out loud. It had taken a wrong first name, a right last name nobody mentioned on purpose, one 11-second alarm nobody logged, and a groan of failing steel to bring two careful, guarded people to the same table. But it was the ordinary evenings after. The bicycle chains, the tea nobody wanted, the postcards from Florida, the brass plate on a restaurant table that didn't say anything dramatic at all, that finally convinced both of them the table was worth keeping. Table 7 was never really about the number. It never had been. It was about who finally sat down, and who, once they had, never once got up and asked to be moved.